Spotlight On is brought to you by Light, the technology platform reimagining e-commerce for live events. You can learn more about Light at light.com/partnerships. That is lyte.com/partnerships.
Hello and welcome to Spotlight On. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. This week, the spotlight shines on Jeff Slate, musician, songwriter, Sirius XM volume host, contributor to major publications including Esquire, Wall Street Journal, The New Yorker, and Rolling Stone. He's a book and liner note author, and now a guest of this podcast. Jeff represents something of the platonic ideal for a guest of Spotlight On. He has informed opinions, a definite point of view, and he pulls no punches. We left a lot on the table to chop through, and Jeff is definitely a finalist to be our first repeat guest sometime down the road. I look forward to it. In the meantime, hit up jeffslatehq.com for his latest work and all the ways to follow him. Enjoy.
What are we talking about today, Lawrence?
Well, first of all, thank you for making time to do this.
Of course.
And I think what I would like to talk about today is Jeff Slate and the many aspects thereof and the many facets thereof. The jewel that is Jeff Slate. And
bon vivant. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
And as I was digging in to prep for our conversation,
you're like, holy shit, what hasn't this guy done? No.
I uncovered all kinds of tawdry. No, this is not 60 Minutes.
You know, I've been on TMZ. You do know that, right?
What did you do to earn that?
I dragged Paul Simon and I became the most hated man on Twitter for the weekend that Trump was on vacation or something during his residency. And I was just waiting for him to come back from playing golf so I could be not the most hated man on Twitter. I'm like, where is this guy when you need him? Anyway.
All right, I know that story. I know the Paul Simon story, but do me a favor. Tell the listener that story, because it actually, that story sits at the crossroads.
Have we started?
Yeah, we've started.
Okay. All right.
That story sits at the crossroads of something I want to talk to you about. So if you could tell us what happened with your Paul Simon kerfluffle.
Okay. So the short version is I wrote a piece about how Paul Simon selling his catalog was advantageous to Paul Simon and good for him. Mm-hmm. However, in 100 years, when people are studying history, he will be a footnote. He will be forgotten because history is a blunt instrument and it only has room for, who do we know of sort of Beethoven's contemporaries or Mozart's contemporaries or Van Gogh's contemporaries. We only know the big broad strokes. So yeah, of course, if you're a Civil War buff, you know all the generals and you know all the sort of, side roads to the story. But for people studying the latter half of the 20th century, they're going to know the Beatles because they're the Beatles and they represent so much for that period. And they'll know Dylan because, I don't think we know why they'll know Bob Dylan because there's so much to his, his artistic path. But I threw Dylan in there because he had just sold his catalog. I really think it's the Beatles. Maybe David Bowie, maybe Bob Dylan, but really it's going to be the Beatles because they're, more than Elvis, more than Sinatra, more than all those people, they are easily digestible as a pop culture historical reference for the every person who will be reading history in 100 years or 200 years or 300 years. Plus, those songs and what they did will last. It just inarguably will last. We're here 60 years later and people are still listening to Love Me Do. Not by a stretch, their best song, but people, it's got a bajillion strains. So what I was saying is, whatever his, and I lost friends over this that I care about because they read the headlines or the snark on Twitter. They didn't really dig into what I was saying, which is Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, maybe not Joni Mitchell because, for various reasons, but Leonard Cohen, Paul Simon, all these people, when history is written or when history is assimilated in a very long, when we're all dead and buried, nobody's going to know or care who Paul Simon is or was, because it's not an easily digestible story. And his songs, while important to a certain generation and to a certain moment in time, and inarguably he's written some mega songs. I mean, you know, I'm not taking any of that away from him. He will be, you know, he'll be a footnote to the bigger picture of the times. Now, because editors, that was an assignment. I didn't choose that story. It was something that my editor at NBC came to me after he sold his catalog and said, he had come up in other conversations because, you know, he's not the best guy in the world. And so she's like, I bet you have some thoughts. So I wrote a piece, and in the editorial process, we went back and forth a few times. And editors being editors, she added in the bit about him beating Edie Brickell many years ago, and, you know, whatever, which I thought was, you know, not really relevant to the story at hand. Okay, he's a bad guy. You want to talk about how he's stolen from Los Lobos or any number of artists over the course of his career and appropriated that for himself as his own work and basically said, fuck you, sue me to those people, you're nobodies, and it will ruin your career? Yeah, sure. I think that's relevant to the fact that when history is written, the good guys don't, you know, the Beatles are going to be written about because they made all the right choices. Whether, you know, peace and love and, you know, they didn't care about gender affiliation or they didn't care about any of that stuff. They were so forward thinking in so many ways, even amongst their peers, they've stood this test of time because of a lot of ancillary things. But anyway, I thought those things were a distraction. And then, of course, the piece went up, and it was, you know, I've forgotten what the headline was, but it was terrible. You know, it was one of those clickbaity headlines. And most people did not read the piece, because the people who did read the piece, you know, had thoughtful responses. Most people read the headline or read just the Twitter share from some outraged artist, musician. You know, the guy from fucking who created Billions was dragging me. I mean, it's like, you know, you've got like 1 million Twitter followers. I'm just a guy in my fucking, you know, home office. And you know, and so it became a thing on Twitter to drag me. And I got notes from a lot of people who said, we agree with you, but we're not willing remotely to defend me, because they didn't want to be, you know, catch the shrapnel. And I didn't really care. And so I'm a host on Sirius. They wanted me to come on. There was, you know, I got death threats. When I say 10,000 direct messages and emails, I'm not even exaggerating. The hate mail was off the charts. For at least a week, my inbox was just full and full of the kind of hateful, vitriolic kind of stuff that, you know, it named by name my teenage daughter and where she goes to school. Like, you know, NBC security got involved. The president of NBC was contacting people to go, hey, lay off my fucking freelancer, please. You know, it was just like, there was talk of me going on the Today Show. And I'm like, no, if we just let this go, it disappears. This is today's story, tomorrow a little bit, and within 48, 72 hours, it will all be forgotten. Now, the internet is a thing. There's a YouTube personality who did a 1 hour special on what a boomer asshole I am. He didn't even do the littlest bit of research into my biography, my credits, he just dragged me on his YouTube channel, because that's how you get views and that's how you get subscribers. And of course, his followers, being of a sort of, I'm going to get more hate mail now, being of sort of a Trumpy nature, you know, middle-aged white guys with an anger
reactionary,
yeah, went after me. Then it all kicked off again, and the editor was like, I'm really sorry about that. She didn't have to deal with it at all. But, you know, security wanted to see my emails and wanted to know what kind of death threats I was getting. You know, they take it very seriously when you start when they start naming like your kids' names and, you know, be ashamed if something happened. She must be ashamed of you, that daughter at name so-and-so at such and such college. I was like, holy fuck, these people are unhinged. You don't even know Paul Simon. I did get notes from people who are friends with Paul Simon that, you know, I'm mutual friends with, who were pissed off. And I'm like, that's legit. You know, you took umbrage with the fact that it veered a little into the personal. But I also, look, I've had some dealings with him firsthand, and that was part of what I was writing about. But the bigger story was, sorry, boomers, you know, you can't tell somebody that their childhood hero is going to be an irrelevancy in 100 or 200 years, because what does that say about them or their life? So that's what people were reacting to, right?
Yeah, there's a lot invested in that artist.
There's a lot invested, and the whole boomer complex about their heroes being untouchable and, you know, whatever. So it was a colorful, you know, couple of days, week. It dissipated pretty quickly. It's funny, I have this ability to disassociate criticism in a way that no matter how personal the people were getting with me about my music, about, you know, whatever it was, my writing, I just didn't give a fuck. I don't know why, because people around me were saying, like, checking in, like, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I'm fine. It's just, that's the internet in 2022.
Did it benefit you in any way? Were you able to leverage it for any benefit in terms of profile?
I didn't even try. I just kind of let it go. And yes, sure. Look, I could have probably parlayed that onto not the Today Show, but the follow-up show, the Hoda show, the Vicky Lee and Hoda show, or I could have gone on. I could have done the explanation lap that people do when these kerfuffles happen. But it was like, I didn't fucking care. I moved on, so the next one I dragged Eric Clapton, and rightly fucking so. These are genuinely bad guys. So I don't have any qualms about having done it, but I also wasn't going to capitalize it on it in any meaningful way, because it was just a fucking assignment. I didn't, it was just, I didn't even, the funny thing was, it was something that was assigned to me. Normally, I go to an editor and say, I have something I really care about that I want to write about. And because it's a passion of mine, they inevitably say yes, because they feel like you bring a lot to that. You'll sell the story on social media. You'll talk about it on podcasts. And they become, some of these pieces I've written have become evergreen because, I get asked about them all the time. That's great for, especially a lot of my pieces on Esquire. They live outside of Esquire's small universe because they touch on these evergreen, the obituaries I've done for, Greg Allman and Tom Petty and Leonard Cohen. These are things that people quote, they're like in Wikipedia articles and stuff like that. And it's like, that drives traffic. That's what they love. Or the art, or the interviews I've done with, Jimmy Page or Noel Gallagher, who are great interviews and say things that people, write about on the internet, or Robert Plant for that matter. And so the pieces tend to live outside of the moment in time when the person was promoting their latest X. But no, sure, I could have done that. It's kind of not my style. I feel like I built my brand on, and that was the other thing, just to backtrack a little bit, that when people were criticizing my writing, I thought to myself, you're a keyboard warrior. I've written, and I don't mean this in an egotistical way, but I have legitimate credits to my name, the New Yorker, the Wall Street Journal, or Esquire, or Rolling Stone, wherever. Somebody thinks I'm a decent writer, right? So I'm going to feel like whatever I feel, because I'm my absolute worst critic, whatever I feel about a specific piece, I've built that career. People were criticizing my music. Well, I certainly didn't say I was as great as Paul Simon, because that would be fucking ludicrous, right? I'm Jeff Slate, he's Paul Simon. Those things they're different for a reason, right? I'm just a B-level guy who plays clubs for, maybe 300 or 500 people at a pop, and he can do whatever he fucking wants. So you're going to say my songs aren't as great as The Sounds of Silence? Thanks. Even my mom would agree with you. So, it was just the stupidity involved didn't lend itself to me doing that kind of Marv Albert, kind of, well, let me explain myself. Fuck you. It was just, it was also giving air to people that I feel like we give way too much air to. The guy, I still, because people still discover it on YouTube because he has millions of followers, I still get hate mail from this YouTube followers guys because they are that reactionary bunch. And it's like, they're barely English, these, and they're from English speakers. They're barely English, and they're just, it's like, not only did they not read the piece, they didn't even watch his whole video. It's like,
just to the part that could get them good and outraged, and they step away and channel the outrage.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, do you want to know how many people I responded to, like actually took the time to respond to? Literally 0. Friends, famous people who took umbrage because they were friends with Paul, crazy people on the other end of a keyboard. People wanted to interview me for their pieces, responding to my piece. The TMZ people who wrote about the kerfuffle, whatever. I responded to literally 0 of them because fuck it. And sure enough, it went away.
Yeah.
Because that's the internet.
Well, so that sort of puts in relief for me one of the questions I had coming into this conversation, which was, is there ever, or do you experience ever, a conflict between those two parts of your professional life? Does your work as an artist and your work as a journalist ever create dissonance for each other, or any kind of complications for each other?
Well, yes and no. The short answer is no. But from a professional standpoint, if you were my agent...
there goes your touring gig with Paul Simon.
Exactly. And that's the thing. You know what? This isn't what I say when I'm on Sirius, because I'm, my personality on satellite radio is curmudgeon, lovable curmudgeon, maybe, but mostly just curmudgeon. There aren't enough John Lennons or Joe Strummers or whatever in the world saying, you know what, that sucks. That guy's an asshole. That guy should be taken down a notch. And maybe I'm right and maybe I'm wrong. And I'm not saying I'm John Lennon or Joe Strummer. What I'm saying is there are too many people who have been corporatized into being the blandest version of musician, artist, rock star, writer possible. They don't want to upset advertisers. They don't want to upset other musicians. They don't want to upset. Fuck it. Say what you think. Stand for something and say that. And if you can't defend it, if Paul Simon were in this room right now, I would absolutely have the argument with him. And I bet if I was able to get a word in edgewise, I would be able to convince him that I'm right, that in 200 years' time, nobody's going to know or care who Paul Simon is. Now, I'm not a soothsayer. I can't read the future. But if you look at the way history evolves and history books are written, they're top line. They're the most basic version of historical events, written by the winners. The winners in this case being the Beatles. They have so many people who wave their flag for them. They are going to be the people who are written about in 200 or 300 years.
It's just something I wanted to, that you were saying before, I want to come back to, and it ties to your
but I just want to finish that thought too, because I think if you stand for something, look, you can be a milquetoast version of a rock and roll star, and you can create. Dave Grohl is a perfect example, and I'm happy to take this on with his millions of fans. But that music that the Foo Fighters make is absolutely worthless. It's barely melodic, but it's worthless music. It's not going to last. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and millions of fans. I get it. But that's because the bar is so fucking low right now. He's a nice guy. I have no doubt that Dave Grohl is a nice guy, but being obsequious doesn't make you a great artist. It's just sort of, it's the sort of, the Archies of the aughts, I mean, I've never listened to those kind of artists, and I'm never going to listen.
Yeah, if rock and roll had a Rotary Club, he'd be the president of the Rock and Roll Rotary Club. It's a great job. He's an advocate. He's a brand ambassador for rock and roll.
Yeah, and my best friend, who's buddies with him, I'm sure has a completely different opinion, and he's a really opinionated guy. But you get co-opted by the corporatized nature of everything. And if you say something negative about somebody like him, you lose access. Well, you know what? The people I interview, I go there and I respect what they've done, and I write about them with respect. And I think this goes to your point. I think I'm seen as a fellow. I know, because artists have told me, I'm seen as a fellow traveler. I understand what they're talking about. I write about their careers with an empathy that a regular rock and roll journalist oftentimes can't. I've done those all-nighter road, from going from fucking Leeds to London or whatever it is, and the van breaks down in the middle of winter and you're out of gas or whatever the fuck it is. I've experienced stuff that 99% of rock journalists, although it's changed a little bit. There are some people who do both things like I do now, have never experienced. And that creates a different dynamic between me and the people I talk to. And so, I also am not going to, Dave Grohl's been promoting, they've got a movie, he's had a book, he's had an album, he's had, a million things that he's promoted in the last 6 months. I know his publicist. I could have easily interviewed him, but the reason when I interview somebody, it's because I'm really behind what they've done. And not just because I like the person personally, although that oftentimes helps. It's because I really believe, like, I went in to interview Jimmy Page, and I told him almost right off the bat that I'm not a Zeppelin guy. I'm not a Zeppelin guy. Yardbirds and some of the other stuff he's done, but that wasn't my band. That was my brother's band. And we started talking about bootlegs, and he asked me how many Led Zeppelin bootlegs I had, and because they're on a hard drive, I said 256. And he said, how are you not a Led Zeppelin fan, but you have 256 bootlegs? And I said, because you're fucking Led Zeppelin. It wouldn't be, if I walked in here and didn't know literally everything you've done, that's my library. That's the backbone of rock and roll. If I don't know everything about Led Zeppelin, as a guy coming into the room to interview Jimmy Page, I'm not worth anything. And he was like, we had a 2-hour conversation about bootlegs. We hit it off because I respected what he had achieved and what he was able to accomplish in his lifetime as an artist, which very few people do, even if I wasn't going to go home and put on Led Zeppelin 4.
Yeah. Your comment earlier about, a few things about the Beatles and about boomers. So to me, I think about the Beatles.
And thank you very much for reigniting this conversation.
Yeah. We're going to leave it behind now.
No, we're not.
Every few years, the Beatles do something that completely surprise me and bring them not just back to relevancy, but back to the forefront of the pop culture conversation. And I remember, I'm going to get the chronology wrong, but just as examples.
Sure.
When the Beatles embraced Rock Band, the video game, that seemed like a major deal. When Love premiered in Vegas with Cirque du Soleil.
Mashup Beatles. Yep.
Yeah. All these things they do that are incredibly culturally relevant. They do it at a higher quality than everybody else, because everybody and his brother at this point has a making of, behind the scenes epic album documentary, right? Only the Beatles do one that's hours long, and we all watch it and talk about it. So all preface to say, the good and the bad in this for me, from where I come from, the boomers will not leave the stage. And it's crowded out, in my opinion, I think, our generation. And I can really get a chip on my shoulder about if I want to get worked up about it, but like, they don't retire. They don't leave the professional world. They don't leave the public world. They're not leaving politics. And it's having a very, very detrimental effect.
Absolutely.
And then we have a very smart, driven, frankly, very interesting generation breathing down our necks. And to me, like I, as a person of a certain age, I start to think like, I'll be okay to step aside because I'm really interested in what people are doing now. So that's the negative. But the Beatles in a way they are the typical boomer representation. They're now they're much more justified in it, and they
beget. We had in the mid-90s we had the anthology, and it was amazing, and they reunited and they released their outtakes, and the documentary was just the first-hand thing. And it wasn't a bunch of talking heads. It was just them, and the book, sort of added to all of that. But what happened after that was literally every single pretender Beatles had to release their outtakes and their book and their documentary and their most.
Remember number ones? Every band did a version of number ones for a while.
Yeah. So because they're all sort of, everybody wants to be in league with the Beatles or at least ride their coattails from a marketing standpoint. It's part of its band, intra-band egos driving it, and part of its management who are just like, ka-ching, we'll put out a greatest hits and everybody will buy it, because they bought the Beatles one, they're going to buy it. If they even sell, that Beatles one has sold like 30 or 40 million copies worldwide. So if you can sell 1% of that, 10% of that, if you're a also ran group, you're the fucking Hollies or some bullshit band like that, then sure. And yes, I'm calling out Hollies fans. So, so you're right that, but there is justice in the world because you know what? They're all dying. And I don't mean the artists who, look, many of the artists we could list as pretenders to the throne from that period, I love too, and I listen to, and they're my heroes as well. However, the fans are, they're only going to live forever, only going to live so long. They're not going to live forever. And so, interestingly, Neil Young's been in the news because he pulled his music from Spotify. The part of the story nobody wrote about, and look, it was a great thing and a great moment because it brought attention to the story. But my initial reaction was, I went to Neil Young's Spotify streams, and nobody listens to him. Young people, the boomers don't have Spotify by and large, and young people, they listen, but they didn't listen in any meaningful way. There weren't, he had that new album with Crazy Horse. There was only maybe one song that was over 1 million streams. Most of them were in the low 100,000s. That's a major artist who just released a new album. Those things get 1 million streams just off the bat, like Jimi Hendrix re-releases get, of just bullshit outtakes get 1 million streams. So, so it was his name and that it was a conversation starter that was important, but because the boomers are so prevalent in the media and on Twitter and all these other things, and it was a cause people could get behind because it's such a fractured time right now. And Joe Rogan's such an easy villain, he's just such an easy villain. But the underlying thing about that is that, people don't listen really to Neil Young. They just don't. Not in the numbers that they used to even 5 or 10 years ago. Now, that's a bad thing because he's Neil Young, but what it also means is whatever's happening in your social media feed is not necessarily reality.
Yeah.
Young kids who are cherry picking the music they listen to, they know who Neil Young is, and they're After the Gold Rush is on their playlist or Decade is on their playlist, but not much beyond that. you know? So,
well, in a country where the number one album sells 80 or 100,000 copies in a week, in a country of 360 or some odd million people,
right.
It's very difficult to have a clear conversation about sort of like cultural impact versus media noise versus, like you're saying, who has access to the megaphone.
Yeah. Well, look, there will. What's interesting is, and this is, I'm saying this, I'm thinking this in real time, so it's maybe wildly wrong, but I wonder if there will be a tipping point when the boomers, as a cultural reference, just sort of drop off the face of the earth as a conversation, that they won't be controlling the media and the stories. They won't be the big name artists anymore. And they won't be. And what I wonder is, will there then be such a huge generational shift that our generation, from sort of Bowie to the Clash and maybe a little bit later than that, just kind of get lost, because it will be, the nostalgia will then be for like Oasis and Nirvana. It will just sort of leapfrog to that generation who are so adept at the internet and nostalgia, and in not a nostalgic way. I mean, it's a contrary, but it's like, younger people talk about, my stepdaughter talks about Liam Gallagher not as like a historical figure, who in many ways he is. She likes his style, and that's the 90s. But to them, that's a really, that's it's current, and yet it's just part of the firmament. So it'll be interesting to see, do the people we loved, and obviously Bowie and the Clash will not be forgotten. They're huge, mega touchstones in pop culture history. But there were so many people, T-Rex, our T-Rex, who deserve to be remembered, just gonna kind of be like the Bay City Rollers to kids. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think the artists that reached their status, superstar or otherwise, between say 70 and 90, they're the ones I think their legacies are the most at risk, right? It was before the real media explosion and the sort of globalized media, drowned out to a large extent by this sort of the long arm of the boomers. The Clash is a tough one to think about, because I don't know if I just give them more importance because of what they mean to me, but I don't really know anybody who talks about them.
It's funny because I've had a book in the works. I know all the guys and everybody in the circle. I was part of the sort of New York Clash posse toward the end, and when I was a very young guy, and I've kept in touch with everybody. And Joe Strummer lived in my neighborhood for a while, and it was they just meant so much to me. But yeah, I've never really pulled the trigger on writing that book because it feels like, yeah, there's a constituency for it, but it's a lot of work, and I want to write it, and I feel like it's important, but I also want it to be read. I don't want to do all that work and then, have the, couple thousand real diehard faithful buy it and not have it reach the intersection of, sort of kids who are discovering. And look, the Clash have not been well served by, their legacy has not been well served for any number of reasons. They just haven't tended it. Joe dying really was tough on the band because he was a front guy. He was the cheerleader. He was the advocate. The other guys don't really have the same vested interest in doing it, and their management has been all over the place with the way they've handled it. So, and I know all these people. I'm going to get hate mail for this, but the numbers don't lie. The Clash sort of do good streaming numbers, but could do much better. They could be so part of the pop culture conversation. There's always politics, culture, sort of whatever. I mean, they were I remember when walking around New York City in the summer of 1981, when Magnificent Seven was everywhere. And to my young, very young, suburban bred ears, I wanted to know what that music was. So I discovered, by way of Mag 7, hip hop and rap. And so by the time I moved to New York City in 84-ish, I already knew, I'd seen a bunch of these artists and was part of the scene when I got here. It was so, that they were the gateway drug to so many other kinds of, politics and culture. And, so I think they're one of those stories that I think it will take history to shake out. Will they be remembered because they were so remarkable? They were just so different than everybody else. Sort of the way that, David Bowie 10 years ago was beloved, but not on the level that after his death, everybody and his brother realized, oh my God, I love David Bowie too. It's not just the weirdos from my high school class. I love that music as well. Oh my God, that soundtracked my life too. And there was this outpouring, whereas now everybody identifies as a David Bowie fan, whether, they were late to the party or not. And that's fine, because what does that mean for his legacy in 50 or 100 years? Well, that means the kids who are in their teenage years now, when they're old, talking about this guy who changed their lives because they identified with him, he will still be relevant.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
for sure.
Anyway, we're like a half hour in, and we haven't covered anything but like.
Well, let me pivot to something else for a second. You mentioned when you moved to New York. How aware were you of some of the different musical scenes that were percolating at that time? I think about, there was sort of the downtown no wave stuff going on, and sort of like that. What evolved into like the Knitting Factory and all that. Where were you playing, basically? What playground were you romping around in musically?
Ironically, I gravitated toward the sort of dance hip hop crowd because it was, and I'm going to get into hot water because I'm going to paint with broad brushes here. But my experience in the punk scene, even before I moved here, because I was in bands and we would come here and we'd play CBs and wherever, the people I met were not, I always come across on these podcasts as an Anglophile because I love the Clash and I love Paul Weller and the Jam and, whatever. But the reality was there was nobody I met or saw that struck me as having that quality of artistic determination. And the ones who did, when you'd meet them and talk to them, there wasn't much there. And if there was something there, they were fucking racist. They were just like small-minded guys from Queens or whatever. And that broke my fucking heart over and over and over because, we didn't have YouTube or social media back then. We heard about a band. We caught a fanzine in the local record store. We were all hot to trot. And then we went to see them and they were kind of like, oh, they're not really what I expected or kind of okay. And all these people were accessible. The New York punk scene was, pretty accessible. And then you'd talk to them and they always disappointed. Oh, I can't remember being knocked out by somebody and being like, I got to meet this guy, and then going to meet him and have him be like, blow me away with their, I remember so vividly the first time I met Joe Strummer, it changed my fucking life. He was listening to Charlie Parker, and he was just, he talked about a lot about Woody Guthrie, but he talked a lot about Charlie Parker randomly. And what did we do? We went to the record store and stole, mind you, because we were kids, a bunch of Charlie Parker records. And we're like, holy fuck, Charlie Parker's amazing. I don't know if our little 13-year-old, 14-year-old brains knew what Charlie Parker was doing, but Joe said Charlie was cool. Joe said, you know, Grandmaster Flash and Furious 5 were cool. He said Curtis Blow was somebody to check out. He was like, you know, I was at those shows where those guys got booed. I was young enough to look around and go, what the fuck are these people booing at? These guys are awesome. And go to the record stores in Times Square. There's a Colony Records or wherever, or just up the street, there was a hip hop store. And they had everything. And it was just like, you could grab, I didn't even know who these people were. You'd say to the guy behind the counter, what should I get? He'd give you 2 or 3 12 inches. You'd take them home and they would blow your fucking mind. The punk bands weren't doing that for me, or the post-punk bands, or the new wave or whatever. And a lot of it had to do with, I mean, a lot of it had to do with the fact that I grew up loving soul records, and there weren't a lot of good rhythm sections. The drums and bass were always a hurdle for me as a listener. And then the songwriting was, you know, sometimes it was interesting, but the melodies were like, okay, well, we're going to play as punky as possible, because it became a brand. We're going to play as punky as possible, so we're going to bury that melody, and we're not going to give you anything. Meanwhile, the hip hop guys were leading the way. They were writing stuff that was like endlessly tuneful, that drew you in. It was fun. It was fun. And they also had something to fucking say. So I remember there used to be a club here called Negril, where Don Letts, who's the filmmaker, who is the DJ who introduced the Clash to reggae, dub, and, you know, all that other stuff back in London at the Roxy. He used to DJ, I think it was Thursday nights here on 2nd Avenue. And you'd go, and it was a cool scene as a 14 or 15-year-old kid to be let into. But I think about it now, and all the people who were there were people that I still like, even though I've lost touch with most of them. But like the Beastie Boys were there, and Rick Rubin was there, and a lot of the young, you know, Run DMC, and a lot of the young hip hop guys were there. The Big Audio Dynamite guys who were, you know, came from the Clash would be there. Those are all people who were like seekers. You know, they were like, they were what I imagine, you know, the Speakeasy or Ronnie Scott's was like in the 60s. You know, they were the Bag of Nails. It was this very kind of like, I heard this new cool thing. It didn't matter if it was fucking speed metal or, you know, a white label dub record from Jamaica. Don would put it on and everybody would listen. And if you went to the rock and roll clubs, that scene was small and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And look, the reality is the people who were part of that New York punk scene now are broke and complaining about how New York isn't the same as it was. And the guys that I mentioned from that Negril scene are like, you know, rule the world.
They rule the world.
So you know, I
can we look at that for a second though? So I mean, when hearing you speak,
this is not what you plan to talk about.
No,
okay.
No, it's wonderful. The hearing you speak on it, I a few things come to mind for me. One is hip hop. I think of it as an inclusive genre, and not just in the modern DEI sense of the word, but like all that mattered when you put on a record or you're going to sample something was it good? Yeah. Did it move you? Did it kick? Yeah. It wasn't about weeding out music, whereas a lot of rock scenes they define their authenticity by like some kind of purity. And is it fast enough? Is it hard enough? Is it bluesy think is it twangy enough? Whatever the qualifier is. And after a while, it just gets so inward and navel gazy. I think the scenes peter out, or they just stay parochial and marginalized. Is there something to that, or am I full of shit?
No, I think you're right. I think, look, I was, as you were saying the words, I was identifying, because certainly when I was a teenager, I was against more things than I was for. I couldn't find stuff to listen to because it would inevitably, the people would disappoint me, or it was bloated, or it was, but I was so angry because, I mean, there was a point, I was in a band when I was about 12 or 13 years old, And I was like a Beatle fan. I was like obsessed, Beatles, solo, whatever. And I was, and one weekend, one of the guys in the band, they were all a little bit older than me. They were like 14 or 15 and I was 12 or 13. And we were terrible in a basement, drinking beer, playing, bad versions of Lucille or whatever. So I knew, let me go back that I loved the 50s rockers. Chuck Berry, Little Richard changed my fucking world, Buddy Holly and Roy Orbison and Elvis, those were like, and the Beatles. That was kind of it for me. And I had also, because I had a brother-in-law who was a session trumpet player, would inherit just whatever records, he'd have to learn stuff and then he'd pass them along to me. I loved sort of late 60s, early 70s soul. So I had a really formidable collection of like the Isley Brothers and, Psychedelic Shack and, Marvin Gaye and Sam Cooke but deeper stuff too, like a lot of Stax stuff and VJ stuff and specialty stuff. It was like a really, really weird kid growing up in suburban Connecticut. I mean, my friends were listening to Kiss and Alice Cooper, and I was like, man, did you hear that live Isley Brothers record? And they were like, what the fuck is, the Spinners are fucking the Delphonics, brother. They're like the thing, or the Philly sound or any of that. Although the Philly sound was a little too polished for me. I liked it, kind of. Anyway, so this guy walked into rehearsal one day and gave me the Who Sings My Generation, which was the American version of My Generation by the Who, the first record. I think Ahmad Khan's by the Jam, and There Are But Four Small Faces by the Small Faces. And around the same time, a teacher gave me a copy of Village Green Preservation Society and King Size. And those 5 records
that's a
changed my fucking life. Because what I realized was the American artists who were all over my radio, my AM radio, were playing, they didn't have, it took a bunch of English art school guys playing their version of soul music with loud guitars for me to go, oh, that's my music right there.
Yeah.
The Small Faces, that's my fucking band. Or that early Who that was just sort of, just off the charts, cool and maximum R&B. And the Jam too. And so I've always measured everything by that, because those guys didn't have to contend with the original sin of race that we did, so many of our artists, even though they may not have been racist themselves, but they grew up in this American culture of ours that it's silos. Those genres in music were created. John Baptiste talks about this much more intelligently than I do. But genres were created to keep things in their boxes. If we could just listen to anything, I mean, the old BBC or Radio Luxembourg, they played fucking anything.
Yeah.
We always had, there was a white country station, and there was a black blues station. Nobody listened to the black blues station. That was like, except Bob Dylan under his pillow in Hibbing, because he could get it if he dialed it just right on Sunday night and stuck his arm out the window, whatever. So by and large, for me, a lot of the drummers and bass players, they don't swing the way those guys from England. I've played with American drummers of every age. I play with English drummers of every age, and the English drummers always have a swing that the Americans don't. And I like, they're not more soulful than we are, but they just have a broader palette that they're drawing from, because the genres weren't as relevant. They were listening to ska and dub and stuff at parties in the 80s when that was someone else's music, as far as we were concerned.
Yeah. What role did radio play for you when
I'm
you were a
getting
kid?
so much hate mail for this podcast. I'm like, I wrote, it's like I wrote a column for NBC once about how Little Richard, who literally changed my life, seeing him, was the true king of rock and roll, but how he scared people in America in the 50s. And I got so much hate mail from white people who weren't around in the 50s. They were in the 60s when he had his sort of second burst of fame, taking issue. Oh, we listened to Richard just like we did Ricky Nelson. First of all, fuck you, you didn't. And second of all, you're misremembering the way things were. You're looking at it with that gauzy thing that we Americans love to do, to look at the 50s or early 60s before the Beatles came along. Richard was not part of the public consciousness except for his outrageousness or the things he did that almost got him thrown in jail. And, so you remember Tutti Frutti? No, you don't. You remember the Ricky Nelson version, or you remember the Pat Boone version, right?
Yeah. Forget race. He was touching all the third rails back then. Race,
all the third
gender.
rails. I saw him. So I came late to the party. I remember seeing him on the Mike Douglas show one afternoon. I was laying on the floor with my head in my hands, watching the color TV, and he came on. I can't remember the name of the song, but he did an Aretha Franklin song. It wasn't even one of his big hits, but he was head to toe in sparkly pale blue, powder blue outfit with the big hair and the whole thing at the piano in full Richardness. And I was hooked. I had seen God. And I remember also that my grandfather was sitting in the recliner behind me, tut-tutting. And that just made me love him more. I didn't have any beef with my grandfather, but I knew what he didn't like made me love it. I was just like, oh my God. It was like I couldn't. And the thing was, there were no repeats. There was no YouTube. It was a moment in time that I can picture in my mind right now. That it changed my life much more than seeing Elvis, who was, because Elvis was like an alien. He was so perfect. He was so beautiful. His voice was so amazing. Even when he got heavy later, he was just so Elvis, whereas Richard was like, what the fuck did I just see? Chuck Berry, they were clearly guys who lived on this world, where Elvis kind of didn't seem like he lived in this world with us.
Yeah, I don't know that anybody was, other than parents maybe at the very beginning, I don't know that anybody was ever afraid of Elvis. But I would reckon to guess there were people that saw Little Richard, kids, and said, holy shit, I'm afraid and captivated. Like that is what you want your rock and roll to be.
Yeah. I remember the brother-in-law I mentioned gave me a cassette with it was like a mixtape of stuff he thought I should hear. And I was probably 8 or 9 years old. And I remember it opening, but I could be wrong, with Crosstown Traffic. And I remember it scaring me on my headphones, right? Like, what the fuck is this? But I was completely won over. Like instantly, like, rewind, hear that again. How many times can I play this before the tape breaks? It just like it was, and I wonder, we're of a generation where rock and roll music was already accepted as an art form. And so it was like the go-to place for creative or the weirdo kids to go to sort of find the people that spoke to them and spoke their language and spoke for them. We'd read all the interviews and it was like, I'm picking that guy because he's got Joe Strummer and John Lennon, because they got my point of view, and they're all fuck you, and they're all, they're really fucking smart, and I'm, oh my God. I think we're missing something, and I don't want to be one of those guys who's like, it was better in the old days, but I know, talking to my kids, that they at once see Jimi Hendrix and certainly Little Richard and John Lennon or Joe Strummer as completely historical figures who are also relevant, in some weird way, but they're not experiencing it in real time. When you have the entirety of the musical database at your fingertips at all times, traveling across town to get to tape your friend's new record and take it home and listen to it on the bus and like play it over and over and over, and Xeroxing his liner notes at the library because you can't fucking afford the $4 record or whatever it is. There's something to that experience that it in my mind, it has lessened. That's done more to devalue the art that we grew up with and love so much than social media and Spotify and piracy and all that. It's like the mystery of it.
Oh, forget it. You talked earlier about some of the bands kids liked growing up, but I can remember like, you'd get these weird glimpses, like Kiss would show up on a random TV show. They'd be on Paul Lynn or something, and it'd be like
Dinah Shore.
Yeah,
right?
what was that I just saw? Like, and
I remember seeing
to your
Iggy
point,
Pop
like then it's
Dinah
gone.
Shore. Yeah.
Whoever the booking agents were for those shows were twisted. Putting Iggy Pop on Dinah Shore is brilliant.
What's amazing? I was so obsessive about this stuff. I had a little cassette deck by the TV, and I would record the audio.
Yeah.
So like when Hard Day's Night was on TV, I had like my 90-minute cassette, and I would record the audio of it and listen, because we couldn't. That was the only chance that Saturday afternoon at 1:00 to see a Hard Day's Night for like a year.
Yeah, for a year.
It wouldn't be on again. Right?
Yeah. Where in Connecticut are you from?
New London, Connecticut.
Okay, I'm from Hamden.
Oh.
Yeah, so right down 95 from you.
Yeah.
I always tell people it's like the Mason-Dixon line. New Haven's the Mason-Dixon line of Yankees and Boston Red Sox fans. And the pull goes in those two directions. But more broadly, it's the pull between New York and New England is sort of manifest in that part of Connecticut. It is,
and yet, and I weirdly, because my dad had family in New York and was a Yankees fan and a Giants fan, and my sister and my brother-in-law lived here in New York City, and we were not part of that that sort of New England Patriots, Boston Celtics, Boston Red Sox contingent, much to the chagrin of 90% of my friends. They were all on that, but there's also very much two New Englands, and there's a really, like my experience with the guys from Queens who were the punk rockers, who were like, they were not quality people. They came from like anti-busing families, and it's like a little bit of the South in Queens. There's a lot of that in New England, and it's sort of the unspoken underbelly, but there's a lot of small-mindedness there. And I was really, really, really fortunate to have my dad in particular, who that was just not his. He came from this family who'd been in that area for like literally 400 years. And I think because of that, had the ability like to feel apart from all that. He didn't feel like any of that. There wasn't anybody nipping at his heels. He wasn't a wealthy guy by any stretch, but he just didn't feel like he was secure in who he was. He didn't feel like there was anybody going to take his job or anybody who had to be better than. So he was during World War II, when he was in college, he had a black roommate and a Japanese roommate. That says everything you need to know about my dad, because I remember talking to the black guy who was his roommate in college much later in their lives, and he was telling me about how nobody would be like, this is 43, 44, nobody would be this guy, the Japanese guy's roommate. Just nobody would have him. And my dad, he was like, he's a cool guy, he's fine, and not only was that a really nice act, it was also something that sent a signal, you know? Like, I don't think he realized, I don't think any of this was like thought out. He wasn't like a super woke guy or anything, but he just was not judgmental at all in that way. And so he wasn't part of that kind of small-minded New England contingent that so many of his pals really were. I mean, they really, really were.
I want to be cognizant of our time together. I know we're nearing the end of the time we booked, but I wanted to ask you, how do you self-identify professionally? Are you journalist / musician? Are you musician / journalist? Do you even distinguish? Like, what's your business card say?
Yeah, who has business cards anymore? We don't leave the house, so we don't have business cards. No. Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, there are some days when I do more of one thing than the other. Mm-hmm. But the really strange thing is, at the end of the year, when I do my taxes, everything is almost always within 10% of being right down the middle. Mm. I don't know how that works out. Now, some years skew, you know, for various reasons, but yeah. So I don't, you know, look, I came to, I'm a musician. I think of myself as a songwriter and a musician, and I'll always be that in my mind. I came to writing when I was a teenager because I wanted to meet and write about the guys I admired. Yep. And then I stopped doing that. You know, I did it in high school and college, you know, wrote about the Clash and the Who and interviewed Ray Davies from the Kinks and even Kiss, you know, like while I was at college for a little extra pocket money. But I was always a musician first. And then in the mid 2000s, late 2000s, I had a couple of kids who I was raising alone. And my band at the time had kind of imploded. Our guitar player had a nervous breakdown while we were on the road. I mean, it was just really a crazy, I mean, we were like, every time we'd tour, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. Things were growing and it felt really good. And then all of a sudden, poof, it kind of, you know, imploded. But the timing was funny because the kids were happening, the band was imploding, and the internet was killing the record business. And so I thought, okay, well, I need to be able to do something to put fucking food on the table. I can't go on the road. And I don't really have any solo career. You know, that wasn't a thought really at the time. The band, I didn't know what was going to happen. And I thought, okay, well, I know how to write. And so I started, you know, just writing about music, really more for fun than anything else. Got asked to review the then new Mark Lewison biography about the Beatles 2012-ish for the New York Times, which, you know, through my agent and, you know, whatever. And for one reason or another, they couldn't, there was a conflict and they couldn't run it, but they were like, this is really good. You should, you know, get your agent to shop this around. And she hit on Esquire and they loved it and published it. And they were like, what else do you have? And so the only thing I could think of was, I know a lot of musicians. So if I put feelers out, I bet I can do interviews with some pretty big names. So right after the Beatle biography I reviewed, I interviewed Ringo because I knew his son through Pete Townshend because I'd worked with Pete. And so I was able to get to Ringo's people and interview Ringo. And then pretty shortly after that, I wrote a piece about Bob Marley because I knew some people in the Clash circle who had some connections and whatever, and then interviewed Jimmy Page and Elton John. So like within a 6-month period, I had these formidable clips, and then it just kind of started to happen. And it was really good because at the same time I was, you know, building this solo career. And so, you know, a lot of it was just, it worked hand in hand, you know, I was never a guy when I was young, and certainly in the late 80s and early 90s, and I was a musician. Like, that was all I did. My friends were musicians and playwrights and actors and voiceover guys and blah, 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 blah. And there was a point where my manager was trying to get me to do voiceovers, and he was also trying to get me to audition for VH1. both of which I dipped my toe in, but they were disastrous. And because I just couldn't see beyond. You're young, you have tunnel vision. You don't want. I didn't want to be one of those guys who was like doing student films and doing this and writing a fanzine and writing. It's like, Jesus Christ, it's like I can barely manage the one thing. But now, I see, particularly in the gig economy and in this pop culture moment, if you have a couple of things that you do well, I'm not saying you should just take on a bunch of stuff just because you can. But like I do Sirius, I guest host on Sirius, and I write about music, and I'm a musician, and those things feed off each other, because when I'm on the air, I'm the resident guy I've done it. I've actually done most of the things we're talking about rock and roll. Not at the level, I'm not like putting myself in league with any of the classic artists. I'm just saying I've experienced, I can talk about these things from a different perspective than a guy who's just a DJ. But I also can't do his job. So that, there's that. But I also think I bring that to the table when I'm writing. If I try to write about music with a sense of empathy that I think a lot of my fellow writers, some do, but a lot of them don't have. Or even if they are musicians, they feel like they need to take that hat off and put it on the rack so they can be a proper writer. I'm doing bunny ears for the folks at home, because they feel like they need to not be an advocate or a fan or whatever. And I don't think that's true.
Yeah. Well, I think if you'd allow me to, I think I'd like to call that the end of our first time together, and maybe we can get together again some point and do it again, because I'd love to talk to you some more. I love your point of view. But I really appreciate you making time to do this. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff Slate. Thank you, Ant Taylor and the team at Light. And as always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On. Get and share all of our past episodes, write a review, even send us a message through our website, spotlightonpodcast.com. If you like what we're up to here, please leave us a review on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Join us again next week. In the meantime, be safe and stay in touch.